In 1863, on the banks of the Missouri River, the last chapter in the monumental undertaking of the Transcontinental Railroad began. The workers of the Union Pacific Railroad began laying their tracks westward from Omaha through the wild heart of the North American continent. Massive challenges awaited them. Away from all civilization, the country was vast, the weather ruthless, and the challenges tremendously energy-sapping. But there was a masterstroke of modern engineering to be accomplished. To tame the wilderness and to conquer it with steel, fire, and steam. Never before had anything like this been ventured, but the time was ripe. In spite of all the challenges, the Union Pacific Railroad managed to cross the endless expanses of the Great Plains and conquer the merciless slopes of the Rocky Mountains. The Central Pacific Railroad approached from the west, but the winter of 1868 brought all work to a standstill. The two lines lay just a few hundred miles across from each other, in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. The dream of the first transcontinental railroad seemed to be within touching distance, but was buried by house-high masses of snow and blown away by icy snowstorms, a dream that had begun almost 4 decades before. In 1830, the prosperous industrial centers on the east coast of the United States of America were poorly connected to the mainland. Insufficiently developed toll roads and slow ship canals were the only options when making long journeys. Farmers, businessmen, and travelers lamented these long, arduous, and above all, unsafe transport routes. They were not only an inconvenience for travelers, but also shackles on an emergent nation's hunger to grow. But at this time, a development from England was taking its first steps and helped keep alive the hope of many cities in the East of reaching greater economic influence and growth. The trust in new technology and the art of the adventurous railroaders paid off. Within a few years, a patchy network of short railroad lines stretched from the coast to the Great Lakes, bringing new wealth and a period of dynamic change. Soon, the first dreamers entered the scene, calling for a gigantic railroad link from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the so-called Transcontinental Railroad. But how is the most enormous project of the century to be funded and executed when the first step had only just been taken? The economic upswing allowed the railroad to grow steadily, and as settlements suddenly appeared on the timetables, which until now had been in the middle of nowhere, the country had grown closer. Soon, entrepreneurial vanities and greed fueled the railroad tycoons' first rivalries for lucrative routes and connections. Meanwhile, the Mississippi formed a border between the vibrant centers in the east on the one side and the untapped settlements and new markets in the west on the other. Yet technological innovation, unbroken pioneering spirit, and a good nose for business would soon bring down this barrier as well and drive the triumphant procession of the railroad on unimpeded. With the overcoming of the Mississippi, the door to the Great Plains opened and the border of the wilderness was pushed back farther and farther west. Civilization, along with everything that goes with it, found its way to the places where the railroads stopped regularly. In 1861, scouts had finally found a route to realize a complete railroad connection from east to west. The vision of a transcontinental railroad, previously viewed with skepticism, now seemed to be within touching distance. But a conflict had been brewing for many years in the Southeast, which now threatened to engulf the entire nation in a wildfire. In recent years, the tensions between the northern and southern states have been steadily increasing. A deep rift ran along economical, political, and ideological divides, right through the still young nation. The tone in both camps became increasingly bitter and drew a gloomy picture in which a greedy, cold-hearted North opposed a lazy, vicious South. The Union was on the brink of civil war. All eyes were on the events of the coming months. The Confederate States surrendered in April 1865. In the end, there were untold victims, devastation, and destruction on both sides, and a period of deep economic recession followed. For the first time, the railroad had also become a decisive factor in the war, a pawn on the map tables of the generals. Where rapturous people had once gathered to cheer on the locomotives, the railroad had become a tactical playing piece during the war, delivering soldiers and materials to the battlefields. Yet the victims and the hardships were not to be in vain. Peace brought North and South closer together than ever before. From the ashes of the war began the Reconstruction, and nothing seemed to stand in the way of the Transcontinental Railroad. The works to cross the continent from the west had already begun several years before in California. An idea, once viewed with skepticism, soon became a project of great public interest, and with each mile of track laid, the hope of uniting America from east to west grew. Yet the climb from California over the snow-covered mountain passes into the inhospitable landscapes of Nevada proved to be one of the greatest engineering challenges of its time. The final hammer strokes at the meeting point of the Central Pacific Railroad and Union Pacific Railroad sparked a storm of enthusiasm across the nation. The time of dangerous ship passages, sluggish river transports, and exhausting wagon journeys was over. Despite all obstacles and dangers, a link between the East and the West was forged. Goods and passengers could now travel unhindered from the Pacific to the Atlantic. In the years that followed, there were still many perils and crises to overcome. But on this day, the foundations for an era of unknown growth and prosperity were laid.